some men make a scene when they've been wronged. They stand up at the table, raise their voice, make sure the whole room understands exactly what was done to them and by whom. I have never been that kind of man. My name is Kenneth Adler. I am 58 years old. I spent 31 years working for the same freight company in Tulsa, Oklahoma, starting on the dock floor at 24 and retiring as Regional Operations Director, which is a title that sounds more impressive than it is. I drive a 2011 Chevy Silverado with a sun-cracked dashboard. I keep meaning to get fixed and never do. I take the same 2-mile walk every morning before coffee because my doctor told me to, and I've done it every single day for 6 years, whether it's 30 degrees or 95. I am, by most measures, a predictable man who values predictability. I am also the man who paid off $67,000 in student loans for my son so he could start his marriage without that weight around his neck. And at his rehearsal dinner, in front of his fiancé's family and every person who mattered to him, he introduced me to the room by saying, and I am not paraphrasing, "My dad is a blue-collar guy, heart of gold, salt of the earth. You know the type." Then he laughed. The table laughed. I smiled and reached for my water glass. I didn't know then that the most significant moment of my life in that regard was 3 minutes away. Welcome to Dad's Silent Revenge. If you're new here, stay a while. Every story we tell involves someone who thought they had the full picture. They didn't. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Here is what you need to understand about my son Joel, before we get to the part of this story that actually matters. He is not a bad man. I want to be clear about that, because what happens at a restaurant in Scottsdale, Arizona on a Friday evening in October could make him sound like one, and it's more complicated than that. Most things involving fathers and sons are. Joel is 31 now. He works in commercial real estate. He married a woman named Isabel. Sharp, composed, came from a family in Scottsdale with a last name that opened restaurant reservations and country club doors. Her father, Leonard, owned a regional chain of medical supply companies. Her mother, Patricia, had the particular brand of warmth that requires upkeep. They were pleasant people. They had worked hard for what they had and felt entitled to exactly as much of it as they'd earned, which is a feeling I understand completely and don't fault anyone for. The problem was not Isabel's family. The problem was what Joel had been quietly telling himself about mine. When Joel was young, we were comfortable. Not wealthy, but stable. 3-bedroom house in a neighborhood where you knew your neighbor's dogs by name. Summer vacations that involved national parks and a cooler in the back of the truck. Christmas mornings that weren't extravagant but were never thin. His mother, Sandra, and I split when Joel was 17, which is a brutal age for a divorce, and I won't pretend otherwise. She moved to Phoenix. He finished high school with me, went to state college, graduated into a job market that handed him enough early success that he started calibrating differently. By his mid-20s, Joel had developed a certain way of presenting his life. The apartment in Denver, the trips to places I had to look up, the friends who had graduate degrees and talked about them, and, gradually, a way of talking about me in those circles that I can only describe as affectionate condescension. He'd do it at dinners, on calls, at holidays. He'd tell stories about me, the way you tell stories about a beloved old dog. Funny, harmless, a little simple. He meant it with love. I'm fairly certain of that. But meaning something with love doesn't make it what it isn't. My wife, my second wife, Helen, noticed before I put it into words. We'd been married 8 years by the time of the rehearsal dinner. She is a retired high school English teacher, which means she hears what people mean, not just what they say, and she has the patience and the precision of a woman who spent 27 years getting teenagers to understand the difference. He edits you, she told me one evening after a holiday call. Every story he tells about you, he rounds down. I didn't say anything. The freight company becomes the dock. The director title disappears. He keeps the truck but loses the context. I still didn't say anything, because she was right, and I didn't have anything to add to being right. Joel called me in February of that year, a Wednesday morning. I was on my walk. He told me that he and Isabel had set the date, October 14th, Scottsdale, and he wanted to talk about the rehearsal dinner specifically. He said Isabel's family was covering the wedding. Leonard had insisted, but that Joel wanted me to know he hadn't asked them to, and that he hoped I wasn't offended. I wasn't. I told him that. There's one thing though, Dad. A pause. Isabel's family is a certain way about things. They're great. They really are, but they care about presentation. I just want the dinner to go smoothly. What does that mean, Joel? Another pause. Longer this time. Just, if you could not bring up the freight stuff. Like, Leonard is going to be there and he runs companies, and I just don't want the conversation to go sideways. You know how you get when you start talking about logistics. I know how I get. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold February air and looked at the oak tree at the corner that had been losing the same branch for 4 years and nobody had done anything about it. Sure, I said. No freight stuff. Thanks, Dad. It means a lot. I finished my walk and didn't mention it to Helen until that evening. She listened without interrupting, which is one of her skills. He's ashamed of you, she said. Not cruelly, just factually, the way she said things that needed to be said plainly. He's nervous about the dinner. He told you to hide what you do for a living. I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. But the sentence stayed with me the way certain sentences do. Quiet, persistent, not leaving. Here is something I never told Joel, and the reason I never told him matters. When Joel graduated from Colorado State with a degree in business, he had $67,000 in federal and private student loans. The private loans had an interest rate that I found unconscionable. He'd taken them out without fully understanding the compound math, which is a thing that happens to 18-year-olds who are trying to build a future and haven't yet learned that the fine print is where the future actually lives. I found out about the full extent of it when he was 26. He mentioned it offhand on a call, the way you mention something you've accepted as permanent, a cloud you've decided to live under. I asked him to send me the statements he did. I looked at them for a long time. At that point, I had been working on something on the side for 4 years. It started the year after Sandra and I divorced, when I had a lot of evenings and a restlessness I didn't know what to do with. I'd spent 20 years inside freight operations, and I understood, at a granular level, where the money leaked. Not the big obvious inefficiencies. The small structural ones. The ones that added up across thousands of shipments to margins that could fund a small country. I started building a route optimization model. I didn't call it anything at first. It was just a spreadsheet that became a program that became something I started showing to a contact at a mid-sized regional carrier out of Kansas City. They licensed it on a trial basis. It worked better than their own systems. They renewed, then expanded the license. Then a logistics consulting firm in Memphis called me. Then 2 others. By the time Joel sent me his loan statements, I had been quietly earning licensing fees for 4 years that, combined with careful living and zero extravagance, had become a reserve I hadn't touched. I paid off his loans on a Thursday afternoon, the full $67,000. I called the servicer, gave them my routing number, and went back to work. Joel called me that evening, shocked. Dad, what? How did you? Don't worry about how, I said. You're clear, start clean, he cried. Joel doesn't cry easily, and hearing him do it over the phone in a parking garage in Denver was something I will carry for a long time. I didn't tell him about the model. I didn't tell him what it had earned. I paid the debt because it was the right thing to do and because I could, and those were the only 2 reasons required. The rest was mine. I never told Helen about the model either, not entirely, until much later. I am a private person about things I'm proud of. I learned a long time ago that telling people about your accomplishments is a request for their validation, and I stopped needing that somewhere in my early 40s. The rehearsal dinner was held at a restaurant in Scottsdale that required a reservation 2 months in advance and had a menu without prices on the guest copies. I know this because when I flipped mine over looking for the numbers, Helen put her hand on my arm without looking up from her own menu. Don't, she said quietly. I was just checking. I know what you were doing. We were seated at a round table near the window, Leonard and Patricia across from us, 2 of Isabel's college friends to one side, and next to Leonard, a man named Douglas Merritt, who was introduced to me as Leonard's business advisor and longtime friend. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, the kind of man who listened more than he talked and, when he talked, made you understand why he'd been doing it the other way. I noticed him. We exchanged the standard pleasantries. He had a firm handshake and looked you in the eye when he used it. I didn't think much more about him at the time. Joel stood up about 45 minutes into the dinner to say a few words. He was comfortable in front of a room. He'd always been that way, even as a kid. Natural ease with an audience. He thanked Isabel's family first. Then Jessica, Isabel's maid of honor, then the friends who'd traveled in. Then he turned toward our table. "And my dad," he said, smiling. "My dad is a blue-collar guy. Heart of gold, salt of the earth. You know the type." He gestured broadly at me the way you gesture at something that explains itself. 30-plus years in freight, still drives the same truck, still takes his 2-mile walk every morning, rain or shine. He paused for the laugh. He got it. "Dad, I love you. You've always been there. Even when I didn't necessarily make it easy." There was warm applause. It was a toast. It was kind. It was also the verbal equivalent of patting a golden retriever on the head and pointing him out to the company. I raised my glass. I smiled. I did not say anything, because this was my son's rehearsal dinner. And he was happy, and I was not going to be the reason the evening became something else. What I did not see, what none of us saw, was what was happening at the other side of the table. Douglas Merritt had gone still, not obviously, not in a way that drew attention. But I happened to glance in his direction just after Joel sat down, and there was something in the way he was sitting. The slight forward lean, the glass held but not raised, that read as a man who had just heard something and was deciding what to do with it. He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked down at his plate. I didn't think anything of it. I turned back to Helen. She was holding her wine glass with both hands, the way she does when she is choosing not to respond to something. "He loves you," she said quietly. "I know." That's what that was. "I know, Helen." She didn't say anything else. I appreciated that. About 15 minutes later, during the dessert course, Douglas Merritt set down his fork. He picked up his glass. He stood up without fanfare and without, apparently, having planned to, because Isabel's mother, Patricia, looked at him with mild surprise and said, "Doug, I'll just be a moment," he said. "I apologize for stepping outside the program." The table quieted. Douglas had the kind of voice that quieted rooms without raising. "I spent 30 years in supply chain consulting," he said. "I've worked with carriers, distributors, 3PLs, retailers, regional and national. I've seen the inside of more freight operations than I can count. I've also spent the last 12 years advising Leonard's companies on logistics infrastructure, which is how we met, and I consider it among the better professional relationships of my life." He nodded at Leonard, who nodded back with the ease of a man who has heard himself praised accurately and didn't mind. "About 8 years ago," Douglas continued, "I was brought in to evaluate a route optimization system that one of my client carriers had licensed. Regional operation, Kansas City. They were running it quietly, hadn't said much about it publicly, but their on-time numbers had improved significantly and their fuel efficiency per hundredweight had jumped in a way that I found frankly difficult to explain through any variable other than the software." He paused. A slight pause. The kind men use when they want a room to stay with them. The system was called CDAR. I spent 3 days with their operations team understanding how it worked. Then I spent about 2 years trying to find out who built it, because the architecture was unlike anything I'd seen from any of the major vendors. The modeling logic was original. Genuinely original. Not an iteration. Not an adaptation. Something built from the ground up by someone who understood freight movement, the way people understand it after decades inside it, not from a consulting deck. The table was very quiet. I eventually traced the licensing back to an independent developer. The name in the agreement was a Tulsa, Oklahoma address. He looked at me directly. "I'm looking at that address right now." I did not move. I held my water glass, and I looked back at him. "Kenneth Adler built CDAR," Douglas said, "while working full-time managing freight operations. On his own time, with his own resources, he licensed it to 3 carriers before I even found it, and by the time I did, 2 major logistics firms had already integrated it into their regional networks." He let that land. I'm standing up because Joel introduced his father as a blue-collar guy with a good heart, and that is true, but it is not the complete sentence. He paused. The man at that table built a logistics optimization system that I have personally recommended to 4 separate clients over the last 8 years. It's still running inside 3 of them. And I have never. He looked around the table slowly, met the person who built it. Until tonight. He raised his glass toward me. Kenneth, the work was exceptional. It has been exceptional for a long time. I'm glad I finally got to say that to your face. He sat down. The room did what rooms do when something true and unexpected lands inside them. It took a moment to find its footing. Then Leonard started clapping, then Patricia, then the whole table. Helen was not clapping. She was sitting very still with her wine glass halfway to her lips, and her eyes were bright, and she was looking at me like a woman who has known something for a long time and has just watched everyone else catch up to it. I looked at Joel. He was not applauding either. He was sitting at the far end of the table with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was a teenager, and had broken something he'd been told not to touch, the expression of a young man doing arithmetic that wasn't adding up the way he'd arranged it. The color in his face had changed, not drastically, but I knew his face. People came over after. Douglas shook my hand for a long time and said things I received as gracefully as I could manage. Leonard looked at me with new eyes, not unkindly, just recalibrated, the look of a man who files information correctly when given it. Patricia said something warm that I don't fully remember. I remember Helen leaning close to me during the congratulations and saying, very quietly, "You have some explaining to do." "After," I said. "Oh, definitely after," she said. "But it's going to be a long conversation." She wasn't wrong. Joel found me near the exit just as the dinner was winding down and people were collecting their coats. He touched my arm from behind, and when I turned around, he looked like he hadn't slept in a week, despite it being a Friday evening. "Dad." His voice was different, careful in a way it usually wasn't with me. "Joel, I didn't know about Seastar. I know you didn't. Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at my son. 31 years old, good suit, the smile he'd inherited from Sandra, the jaw he'd gotten from my father. I'd been watching this face since before it knew how to be a face, and I knew every register of it, because it was mine, I said. And I didn't need you to think differently about me in order for it to matter. He absorbed that. "Dad, what I said tonight, I wasn't trying to, I was just Joel." I kept my voice even. Not cold. Even. "You told a room full of people I was a type. You made me into a category. Salt of the earth, heart of gold, you know the type." I let that sit for a moment. "You do that a lot, actually. You have for a while. You round me down when you tell people about me. You've been doing it since you moved to Denver, and you probably don't realize how often." His jaw tightened. He was listening. "And back in February you called me and asked me not to talk about freight at the dinner because of Leonard." He closed his eyes briefly. "Dad, I'm not angry, Joel. I'm telling you what happened so you have the full information." I paused. "You were embarrassed by what I do. You weren't sure I'd hold up in the room. And you love me, I know that, but love and respect are 2 different things, and you've been giving me one for a while and not the other." He didn't argue. That was how I knew he understood it. "I paid off your loans," I said. $67,000, 3 days after you sent me those statements. I didn't tell you where it came from because the money wasn't the point. The point was that you needed it and I could. And those were the only reasons required." He stood very still. "Cedar paid for that and a few other things. I built it at night after your mother, and I split because I had time and I understood the problem, and I believed I could solve it. I licensed it, and it worked, and I went back to work on Monday like nothing had changed because for me, nothing had. I didn't need anyone to validate it. That's not how I'm built." A long silence. The restaurant noise filled the space between us. "Dad, I'm sorry." He said it quietly. The way Joel said things when he meant them, not the easy performance of apology but the effortful kind, the kind that costs something. "I know you are. Are we?" He couldn't quite finish it. "We're fine, Joel." I said it and I meant it, but I meant the word fine the way it actually functions. Not as okay but as not broken. You have some growing to do around this. That's honest. But you're my son and I'm not going anywhere. He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since Douglas sat down. "I didn't walk you down the aisle," I said, and I watched something shift in his face. I noticed. "At the ceremony tomorrow, if you wanted me to be the one standing next to you when you walk in, I'd do that. But only if you want it. Not for the room. Not because Leonard's watching." He looked at me for a long moment. I want it, Dad. Okay then. And Cedar, he shook his head slowly. I mean, Dad, I spent years thinking. I know what you spent years thinking. How long has it been running? Going on 11 years now. He laughed, but not with humor. With the particular sound a person makes when they realize the map they've been using was missing a significant portion of the territory. I put my hand on his shoulder briefly. Get some sleep. You're getting married tomorrow. He nodded. Swallowed. Thanks, Dad. For all of it. I drove back to the hotel with Helen. She was quiet for the first few miles, which is not her natural state, so I knew she was organizing something. 11 years, she said. Give or take. You built a logistics software system in the years after your divorce, and you told me almost none of it. I told you some of it. Kenneth. She turned to look at me in the passenger seat with the full weight of a retired English teacher who has caught someone in a careful omission. You told me you did some consulting. You did not tell me you built something that a man like Douglas Merritt has been recommending to clients for 8 years. It didn't feel like that big a thing at the time. She was quiet again. Then, that is the most you thing you have ever said. I kept driving. Why didn't you tell Joel? Really? Not the answer you gave him, which was true, the real one underneath it. I thought about that for a while, because I was afraid of what he'd do with it, I said finally. He was already starting to sort people, his mother's world versus mine, successful versus whatever category he'd put me in. If I told him about Cedar when he was 24, 25, I didn't know if it would change how he saw me or just change the label he used. And I didn't want to be a different label. I wanted to just be his father without the asterisk. Helen was quiet for a long time after that. That, she said eventually, is the answer I was waiting for. We drove the rest of the way in silence. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that settles between two people who have run out of things to say because they've finally said the right one. The wedding was the next afternoon. Warm October, Scottsdale doing what Scottsdale does in fall. All golden light and dry air, and the particular clarity you only get in desert evenings. The ceremony was at a venue with an outdoor terrace and mountain views, and the kind of careful floral arrangement that costs more than I was going to think about. I stood next to Joel at the entrance to the aisle. He was in a charcoal suit, and his hands were steady, and he looked like a man ready for exactly the thing he was walking toward. You good? I asked. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I am. We walked in together. I will not describe the ceremony in detail because some things don't require description. Isabel was beautiful. Joel cried during the vows, the real kind of crying, the kind that earns a man credibility rather than concern. I did not cry, because I had decided I wouldn't, and I have been keeping my own counsel on that subject for 58 years without incident. But there was a moment, after the vows, during the ring exchange, when Joel looked out at the guests and then back at me in the front row, and something passed between us that I couldn't have described accurately but understood completely. Not from decades of freight operations, 2 miles every morning, a cracked dashboard, a system running in 11 distribution networks that no one at the ceremony knew existed. A son who had been sorting the world into categories and had just the evening before lost the one he'd put his father in. Douglas Merritt found me at the reception during the cocktail hour. He had a glass of bourbon and the ease of a man who has said what needed to be said and feels good about having said it. I hope that wasn't overstepping, he said. It wasn't, I told him. I've been waiting for someone to say that for a long time. I just didn't know it until you did. He nodded. The second version of Cedar, the one built on top of your original architecture. There are conversations happening about a third iteration, serious ones, backed by a national logistics investment group. Your name came up. He said it plainly, without drama. If you're open to it, I'd like to have a longer conversation. I took his card. I put it in my jacket pocket. I'd like that, I said. He shook my hand one more time and rejoined Leonard's table. Helen appeared at my elbow with 2 glasses of water and the expression of a woman who has watched her husband navigate a significant evening and has opinions about all of it. What did he want? She asked. Professional conversation. About Cedar. Yes. She handed me a water glass. So we're going to have that long conversation tonight. We are. She clinked her glass against mine. Good, she said. It's overdue. Joel called me on a Monday morning in November, 6 weeks after the wedding. I was on my walk. It was cold, the kind of cold that gets into your collar, and the oak tree at the corner had finally lost the branch. Dad, Joel, I've been thinking about everything. What you said at the restaurant, what Douglas said, what I said. A pause. I've been thinking about it a lot. I figured, I owe you more than I've been giving you. I walked in silence for a moment. The branch was on the ground. Someone would have to move it eventually. Yeah, I said. You do. I want to fix that. I don't know exactly how yet, but I want to. Wanting to fix something and actually fixing it are two different projects, Joel. One of them requires the other, but they're not the same thing. A long pause. I know. Okay, that's all I've got for you right now. You know what needs doing. The rest is up to you. He was quiet for a moment. Then, how's Cedar doing? I laughed. I couldn't help it. Still running, I said, same as always. Doesn't need anyone to know about it, just does the work. He laughed too. Small and real. The laugh of a man who heard the subtext and decided not to pretend otherwise. Yeah, he said. I'm starting to understand that about it. We talked for another few minutes about nothing important. His new apartment, Isabel's new job, the Thanksgiving plan. Normal things. The kind of call that used to feel like maintenance, and now, after everything, felt more like foundation. I finished my walk, went home, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table while Helen graded papers from her adult education class at the community center. She still teaches 2 nights a week because she said retirement made her feel like she was disappearing. How's Joel? She asked without looking up. Working on it. She nodded once, the nod of a woman who has said everything she needs to say on a subject and is content to let it develop. I drank my coffee. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that arrives in November when the leaves are gone, and the sky is the color of brushed aluminum, and everything has a stripped-down clarity to it. I thought about Cedar, about the 11 years it had been moving goods through networks, shaving costs, routing efficiently, doing its quiet work without fanfare or press releases or anyone outside a handful of operations teams knowing it existed. I thought about the second-hand operations manual I'd bought at a library sale in 2006 that had given me the initial framework, about the Tuesday nights and Sunday mornings that the model consumed for 4 years, about the day I signed the first licensing agreement at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and a yellow legal pad. I hadn't needed anyone to know. That was still true. It remained true now. Even after Douglas Merritt had said it out loud in a restaurant in Scottsdale to a table of people who had not known, and one person in particular who had spent years filing me under the wrong heading. I finished my coffee. I went to work. Some men need the room to know what they've built. They need the credit first, and the work second, and the audience throughout. I've never been that kind of man. I just needed the work to work. Turns out, it did.